What would you do if you'd given 30 years of your life to one company, worked your way up from the floor, learned every machine, written every safety manual, kept people from getting hurt, and then one Tuesday morning a guy who'd been in the building for less than 6 weeks told you that you had 3 weeks to train your replacement and hand over everything you'd built? Think about that. Not as a hypothetical, as something that actually happened. My name is Scott Harlan. I'm 54 years old. I spent 30 years at Dalton Industrial in Pittsburgh, PA, the last 17 of those as plant operations manager. And what happened to me in September 2024 is the kind of story I used to hear from other guys and think, that'll never happen to me. I've been here too long. I know too much. They need me. That's exactly what they were counting on. 7:52 a.m., Tuesday, September 10th, 2024. I was in the break room off the main floor, the one with the bad fluorescent light that facilities had been getting to for about 4 years. I had a paper cup of coffee from the machine in the corner, the machine that made it taste like hot water with a coffee-flavored memory. I'd been drinking that stuff since 1994. You stop noticing after a while. I had my clipboard. I was going over the morning shift handoff notes, a ritual so old it felt like breathing. Line 3 had a pressure variance on the secondary feed. Line 6 was running about 2% hot, normal Tuesday stuff. That's when Diane Pruitt walked in. Diane was the HR director, mid-40s, always professional, always measured. We'd worked together maybe 8 years. She wasn't the kind of person who came down to the floor break room to chat. When she appeared in a doorway like that, with that particular look on her face, the one that's trying hard to be neutral, you knew something was coming, Scott. Can you come up to conference room A? Roy would like a few minutes. Roy was Roy Tanaka, 42 years old, VP of Operations, sent from the Tokyo office of Nakura Holdings, the Japanese conglomerate that had finalized its purchase of Dalton Industrial back in March 2024. He'd been on site for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, he had held 4 all-hands meetings, introduced 2 new reporting frameworks that nobody understood, and used the phrase operational inefficiencies enough times that someone in the maintenance crew had started a tally on the whiteboard in the back hallway. I set my clipboard down, picked up my coffee, followed Diane to the elevator. When I walked into conference room A, Roy was already seated at the head of the table. Sitting next to him was a young man I'd never seen before. Maybe 30, 31, clean pressed shirt, no calluses on his hands. I noticed that right away, force of habit. A notepad in front of him, already open, pen uncapped, like he was ready to take notes in a meeting he hadn't been introduced in yet. Roy said, "Scott, good morning. This is Pete Drummond. He's joining us as Junior Operations Manager. We'd like you to spend the next 3 weeks getting him up to speed on your accounts, your processes, the full operational documentation." I looked at Pete. He gave me a polite smile and a nod. I looked back at Roy. I set my coffee cup down on the table, slowly. "I'll need until end of week before we discuss a knowledge transfer timeline." I said. Roy blinked. "We were hoping to start tomorrow. I understand. End of week." I didn't say anything else. I picked my coffee back up, nodded at Pete, and walked out. I went back to my desk, sat down, looked at my screen without seeing it for about 90 seconds. Then I opened the bottom right drawer, the one I never let anyone else touch, and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was a copy of my employment contract, the one I'd signed in 2007 when Dalton's second ownership change had prompted a formal restructuring of all senior management agreements. I turned to section 11, paragraph B. I'd read it maybe a dozen times over the years, just to remember it was there. It said, and I'm paraphrasing, but I have the exact language, that any proprietary operational systems, documentation frameworks, or process architectures developed by me using personal time and personal resources would remain my intellectual property unless explicitly purchased by the company through a separate written licensing agreement. I read it twice more. Then I called Neil Wakefield. Neil and I went back to high school in Bethel Park. He'd gone to Pitt for law, built a practice specializing in IP and employment contracts. We grabbed lunch maybe 3 times a year, watched a Steelers game together in the fall. He was the kind of lawyer who skipped the fancy vocabulary and just told you what the situation actually was. I got his voicemail. I said, "Neil, it's Scott. I think I'm about to get pushed out of Dalton. There's a clause in my 2007 contract I need you to look at. Call me when you can." He called back at 11:38 a.m. "Talk to me," he said. I told him everything, the meeting, Pete Drummond, Roy's 3-week timeline. When I got to section 11, paragraph B, and what I'd spent the better part of 17 years building under that contract, he went quiet for a moment. Scott, tell me you kept documentation. Personal notebooks going back to 2003. Files on my home computer with creation timestamps, emails I sent myself as version logs. The original draft of the first operational playbook, I wrote it on a legal pad on a Sunday in November 2003. I still have the pad. Another pause. Do not agree to transfer anything. Not a page, not a conversation, not a verbal walkthrough. Tell them you're consulting legal before any knowledge handoff begins. I'm looking at that contract tonight. They want to start tomorrow. Tell them end of week. You already did? Good. That buys us time. I'll call you tonight. I hung up, went back to looking at the pressure variance report for line 3. I tapped 3 times on my desk with my right index finger. Then I got back to work. Neil called me back at 10:19 that night. I was sitting at the kitchen table. Same table where I'd written the first operational playbook back in 2003. Same chair, probably. The house was quiet. My youngest had moved out 2 years ago, and the divorce had been finalized 4 years before that. It was just me, the table, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I was reading the contract again. I want to say something about that table, because it matters to the story. I bought this house in 1996, 2-story in Carnegie, about 20 minutes from the plant. Took out a 30-year mortgage at 7.5%, because that's what rates were, and you didn't wait around for better, because better might not come. I made every payment. Every single one, even the 2 years after the divorce, when money was tight enough that I was eating sandwiches for dinner 4 nights a week and telling myself it was fine. The final mortgage payment was scheduled for March 2025, 6 months away from the day Roy Tanaka told me to train my replacement. I'm not saying that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm saying it because you need to understand what losing this job meant in real terms. It wasn't just a title. It wasn't just a paycheck. 30 years of my life were inside that plant. Every promotion, every safety improvement, every late night I stayed to troubleshoot a line failure before the morning shift came in. All of it had been pointed at something. At finishing, at being done and being okay 6 months from okay, that's where I was when the phone rang. Scott, it's Neil. I've read the whole contract. Section 11B is airtight. I let that sit for a second. You own that documentation. Everything you built on your own time with your own resources, the playbooks, the safety frameworks, the maintenance schedules, none of it was ever purchased by Dalton. Not by the first ownership, not by the second, not by Nakura. They've been operating on your intellectual property for 17 years without a licensing agreement. So what do I do with that? Tomorrow morning, you go in, you're calm. You don't raise your voice. You tell them that before any knowledge transfer can begin, the company needs to establish a formal licensing agreement for your proprietary materials. You state the facts, you don't threaten, and you don't sign anything they put in front of you. And if they push back hard, then we file. And while that process plays out, you have zero legal obligation to hand over a single page. They need that documentation more than you need to give it. I looked at the legal pad sitting on the corner of the table. The original one from November 2003. I'd kept it in a file box in the closet off the kitchen for 21 years. Hadn't even thought about it much. It was just there, the way important things tend to sit quietly until you need them. Neil, let me back up and tell you why I started writing all this down in the first place. It was 1998. I was shift supervisor on the main floor. I'd been at Dalton 4 years by then, had worked my way off the line and into a supervisory role the hard way, which is the only way it works in a place like that. A guy named Hector was clearing a jam on the secondary conveyor on line 4, standard procedure. Except the standard procedure at that point existed only in the heads of the 3 guys who'd been doing it longest. Nothing written down, no formal clearance protocol, just institutional memory passed from one shift to the next like a game of telephone. Hector's hand got caught in the roller assembly. He kept the hand, but barely. 3 surgeries, 8 months of rehab. He came back to work the following year walking a little different and never talking about it. I stood in that hospital waiting room the night it happened and made myself a promise. If I was going to be responsible for people's safety, I was going to write down every single thing that kept them safe. Every procedure, every workaround, every warning that the manual didn't include because the manual had been written by engineers who'd never run a shift in their lives. I started that November kitchen table, legal pad, every Sunday morning before anyone else was up. By 2005, I had 6 binders. By 2007, when the new ownership came in and wanted everything formalized, I had the foundation of what became the complete Dalton operational documentation library, 14 process playbooks, a 200-page safety compliance framework cross-referenced with OSHA standards, preventive maintenance schedules for every major piece of equipment, and a risk assessment matrix that the plant's insurance carrier actually asked to use as a reference model. When I sat down with the company's lawyer and Neil in 2007 to sign the new contract, I knew what I had. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I just knew what my father had told me since I was old enough to listen. If you built it, put your name on it. Paper beats memory. Paper beats handshakes. Paper beats everything. Section 11, paragraph B went into the contract. Nobody on the company's side pushed back. I don't think they understood what they were agreeing to. I understood exactly what I was agreeing to. Wednesday morning, 8:10 a.m., I got to the plant before Roy. Got my coffee, went to my desk and sat there for a few minutes, just listening to the sound of the floor below, the hum of the ventilation, the rhythmic clank of line 2 running its morning cycle, sounds I'd been listening to since before some of my current crew was born. When Roy came through the main entrance at 8:40, I gave him 5 minutes to settle, then walked to his office. He looked up. "Scott, ready to get Pete started today." Before we get there, I need to clarify something. I sat down across from him without being asked. The operational documentation, the playbooks, the safety framework, the maintenance architecture, those materials are my intellectual property. Section 11, paragraph B of my 2007 contract. They've never been purchased by Dalton or by Nakura Holdings. I'm willing to negotiate a licensing agreement, but I can't begin any knowledge transfer without one in place. Roy stared at me. "Scott, you built those for the company. I built them on my own time, at my own kitchen table, using my own resources. I have documentation going back to 2003. My attorney has reviewed the contract." "This isn't personal, Roy. It's the same thing you'd do if someone asked you to hand over something that belonged to you." His jaw tightened. Not angry, more like a pressure gauge reading higher than expected. "I need to make some calls," he said. Of course I stood up. "I'll be at my desk." At 11:20 a.m., my email pinged. Subject line, "Meeting 2 p.m. today, Conference Room B," from Roy. CC'd to Diane Pruitt and someone named Paula Strickland, outside counsel for Nakura Holdings North America. Short email, formal language. The kind of email that gets written when someone has already talked to a lawyer. I forwarded it to Neil. He called me back in 4 minutes. "I'm coming to Pittsburgh," he said. "Neil, it's a 2-hour drive. I'm already closing my calendar. Do not walk into that room without me. Reply and tell them your legal counsel will be attending." I typed the reply, sent it at 11:31 a.m. Roy's acknowledgement came back at 11:47. 3 words, "That is fine." Neil arrived at 1:35 p.m. We found a small huddle room on the second floor and closed the door. He set his briefcase on the table and slid a bound document across to me. "This is the proposal," he said. "We're asking $480,000. That breaks down as $420,000 for the full IP transfer, covering 17 years of unlicensed use plus current fair market value, and a 3-month consulting contract at $9,500 per month to ensure proper knowledge transfer. Total package $448,500 plus your severance remains intact and separate." I looked at the number $480,000 for the IP. "Scott, that documentation library is the operational backbone of a plant that runs $40 million in annual output. If they lose access to it, they don't just lose paperwork, they lose the institutional memory of how every system in that building actually functions. $420,000 is not aggressive, it's accurate." I nodded, picked up the document. "Read the first 3 pages. "Okay," I said, 2 p.m. exactly. Conference Room B was larger than Conference Room A. Longer table, more chairs, a wall of windows looking out over the parking lot and the river beyond it. Roy was already seated when we walked in. So was Diane Pruitt, hands folded on the table in front of her, expression carefully neutral. And at the far end, Paula Strickland, Nakura's outside counsel, late 40s, dark blazer. The kind of stillness that comes from spending decades in rooms exactly like this one. Neil and I sat down across from them. Paula spoke first. "Mr. Harlan, Mr. Wakefield, thank you for making time. We've had an opportunity to review the employment contract, specifically Section 11, Paragraph B. We'd like to find a practical resolution." Neil slid the proposal across the table without a word. Paula picked it up, read it, passed it to Roy. Roy looked at the number and something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration. He passed it to Diane. Diane read it and set it down. $480,000, Paula said. Not a question. That's correct, Neil said. The breakdown is detailed on page 2. We're open to discussion, but the baseline reflects 17 years of unlicensed use of proprietary materials. The math is straightforward. Roy leaned forward. Scott, you built this documentation as part of your role here. It was always understood to be company property. I looked at him steadily. Roy, I built the first playbook on a Sunday morning in November 2003 at my kitchen table on my own time, before this management team existed and before Nakura Holdings had ever heard of Dalton Industrial. I have the original legal pad, time-stamped digital files, and 21 years of documentation that establishes exactly when and how each element was created. My contract from 2007 reflects that reality. If there was a misunderstanding, it wasn't on my end. The room went quiet. Paula looked at Roy. Roy looked at his copy of the proposal. He tapped the table once, not like my 3-tap habit, just once, the way people do when they're buying time. We'd like to explore a lower figure, Paula said finally. We're open to reasonable negotiation, Neil replied. But I want to be clear, in the absence of a licensing agreement, Mr. Harlan has no legal obligation to transfer any materials. The plant's operational continuity is a shared interest here. Let's find a number that reflects that. Paula asked for a recess, 10 minutes. Neil and I stood in the hallway. I looked out the window at the parking lot below. My truck was in its usual spot, Space 14, where I'd parked every day for 30 years. How are you doing? Neil asked quietly. Fine, I said. 3 taps on the windowsill with my right hand. Fine, I said again. When we went back in, the energy in the room had changed. Roy was quieter. Diane had her notepad out. Paula was the one doing all the talking now, which told me something about where the internal conversation had gone during the recess. We can offer $310,000 for the IP transfer and a 2-month consulting arrangement at $8,000 per month, Paula said. That's our opening counter. Neil didn't blink. We'll come down to $450,000 for the IP and hold the consulting at 3 months, $9,500 per month. That's $478,500 before severance. Paula made a note. We'll need to take this back internally. Can you give us until Monday? Of course, Neil said. We shook hands. Professional, clean. Walking out, I passed Pete Drummond in the hallway. He was coming back from the break room with a coffee. He gave me a slightly uncertain look, like he knew something was happening, but not what. Pete, I said. Scott, he nodded. That was the whole conversation. He didn't know what he'd walked into. That wasn't his fault. That weekend, I didn't spiral. I mowed the backyard on Saturday morning because it needed mowing. I watched the Steelers lose on Sunday, same as usual. I went to bed at 10:30 both nights. But I thought about my oldest son. He was 30, now born the same spring I'd started at Dalton. He lived in Columbus, worked in logistics, called me every Sunday. He didn't know any of this was happening yet. I hadn't told him because I didn't want to until I knew how it was going to land. I thought about what I would say if it went wrong. If Nakura decided to litigate and drag it out. If I ended up in a legal fight that cost me more than I'd win. I thought about it, and then I stopped thinking about it, because there wasn't anything useful in that direction. Monday morning, 9:07 a.m., email from Paula Strickland. Subject line, revised proposal. I opened it. Nakura Holdings was prepared to offer $360,000 for the full IP transfer and a 2-month consulting contract at $8,500 per month. Total $377,000 before severance. I forwarded it to Neil. He called at 9:22. Counter at $430,000 IP. 3 months at $9,500, he said. We're getting there. They moved. That's what matters. I typed the counter, sent it at 9:35. Paula replied at 3:48 p.m. Can we meet Tuesday afternoon? Tuesday afternoon, same conference room, different energy. Roy was there, but quieter than before, the kind of quiet that means a decision has already been made somewhere above his pay grade, and he's just there to witness it. Diane had her notepad but didn't open it. Paula was the one who ran the room, same as Monday, but something in her posture had shifted. Less like an opening position, more like a closing one. We're prepared to offer $400,000 for the full IP transfer, Paula said, and a 3-month consulting arrangement at $9,000 per month, total $427,000 before severance. That is our final offer. Neil looked at me. I looked at him, $427,000. plus 5 months severance at $98,000 annual, another $40,833. Total package, $467,833. I thought about the kitchen table, the legal pad, Hector's hand. 30 years of Tuesdays exactly like this one, except none of the other ones had mattered quite like this. We'll accept $410,000 for the IP and 3 months at $9,500, Neil said. Total $438,500 and $1,500 under dollars and $500 and $500 under dollars for the IP and $300 and $300 and $1,400 for under dollars and $400. Paula looked at the finance representative sitting beside her, a man from Nakura's regional office I'd seen once before and whose name I still didn't know. He gave a small nod. Agreed, Paula said. $438,500 with the 5-month severance package remaining separate and intact. Neil said, "We'll need that in writing by end of week. You'll have it by Thursday." I shook hands with Roy last. His grip was fine, professional. He looked tired. I didn't have anything against Roy personally. He was running the play he'd been sent to run. That's all he was. I understood that even then, sitting in that room. "Scott," he said, "just my name, nothing after it." "Roy," I said, and that was enough. The paperwork took the rest of the week. I signed on Friday, September 20th, 2024, at 2:45 p.m. in Paula's office downtown. The notary was a woman named Gloria Mendez, steady hands, efficient. She didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer anything, just signatures, initials, date, done. The contract was 28 pages. I read every word before I signed. Neil sat beside me the entire time. The first payment, $410,000, cleared my account on Monday, September 23rd at 10:51 a.m. I was sitting in my truck in the driveway of my house in Carnegie when the bank notification came through. I opened the app, looked at the number, refreshed it once. It was real. I sat there for a while. Then I went inside and called my son. I told him the whole thing, start to finish. He was quiet for most of it, the way he gets when he's processing something. At the end, he said, "Dad, you kept a legal pad from 2003. "Still have it," I said. He laughed. Then he said, "Are you okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." The next 3 months, I showed up every day as the contract required. I worked with Pete Drummond on the full knowledge transfer, answered every question, responded to every email, made video walkthroughs for the systems that were harder to explain in writing. I put together a 108-page transition manual, more thorough than anything I'd done before, because this time I was doing it for a company that had paid for it. Pete was a decent person, completely out of his depth in a plant environment, but he knew it and he didn't pretend otherwise. He asked good questions, he stayed late. He wrote things down. Those are the things that matter on a floor, and he figured that out faster than I expected. What I didn't mention to anyone inside Dalton was that, during those 3 months, 4 of the plant's longtime suppliers had reached out to me directly, not through the company, to my personal cell number, which they'd had for years because that's how we'd always worked. They wanted to know if I was going to be available. They weren't asking about Dalton. They were asking about me. My consulting contract ended December 20th, 2024. January 6th, 2025, I registered Harlan Industrial LLC with the state of Pennsylvania. Small office space in a converted building in Lawrenceville, east side of Pittsburgh. Just me and a laptop and the upgraded version of every system I'd spent 30 years developing, rebuilt from scratch on proper infrastructure, with my company's name on it this time. By March, 2 former Dalton colleagues had come on board, guys I'd trained, guys I trusted. By summer, we had 6 people and 11 active clients, small and mid-sized manufacturers across western Pennsylvania who needed operational consulting and safety compliance work done by people who'd actually stood on a factory floor. Year 1 revenue, $1.1 million. Year 2 projection, $2.3 million. We're on track. Every client came through reputation. No advertising, no cold outreach. Just people who'd worked with me for years picking up the phone and calling the number they already had. As for Dalton Industrial, Roy Tanaka was reassigned to the Chicago regional office in February 2025, following a series of what the internal reports called process compliance incidents. Diane Pruitt faced a review over the documentation handoff procedures and how they'd been initiated without proper legal clearance. 3 long-term clients reduced their contracts within 8 months of my departure. One left entirely. Last I heard, Nakura Holdings brought in an outside turnaround firm in the fall of 2025 to stabilize operations at the Pittsburgh plant. Pete reached out to me in February 2026, said working those 3 months alongside me had taught him more than 2 years of business school. Asked if there were any openings at Harlan Industrial. I told him I'd keep him in mind. I meant it. I made the final mortgage payment on my house in Carnegie in March 2025. Exactly on schedule. Nobody threw a party. I just transferred the funds, same as every month for 30 years, and then sat at the kitchen table with a coffee and looked at the confirmation on my laptop screen for a while. Same table, same chair probably. Some things you finish quietly, that's fine. The quiet ones are usually the ones that were worth finishing. Here's what I know after all of this. Companies don't see the infrastructure until it's gone. They see budget lines, they see headcount. They run the numbers on what it costs to keep someone like me versus what they think it costs to replace me with someone younger and cheaper. They don't put a line item on the spreadsheet for 30 years of knowing which machine runs hot on cold mornings, or which safety procedure never made it into the original manual because it was figured out on a Tuesday afternoon in 2006 and passed down by word of mouth ever since. You can't automate that, you can't train it in 3 weeks, and you can't take it from someone who had the good sense to write it down and put his name on it. My father fixed boilers in the Strip District his whole working life. Never went past high school. He told me when I was about 16, if you built something, write it down. If you wrote it down, make sure your name is on it, because someday somebody's going to tell you it belongs to them. And on that day, the only thing that matters is what the paper says. He was right about that. He was right about most things. I include a version of Section 11, Paragraph B in every contract I sign now. Every client engagement, every subcontractor agreement, every piece of paper that involves my work and somebody else's signature, it costs nothing to put it in. It cost Nakura Holdings $438,500 to find out it wasn't there. Paper trails beat handshake deals. Every single time. That's the whole story. What would you have done differently? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, working men who got pushed and pushed back the right way, hit subscribe. These things happen more than anyone talks about. I think it's time we start talking about it. The day they asked me to hand over everything I'd built is the day I found out it was never theirs to ask for.